Now that we've gone through the overview of different aspects of measurement and spent some time talking about reliability, we're now going to look at how measurement applies to validity and the importance of validity. So specifically, validity refers to how well a measure actually assesses what it's trying to assess. There's a given construct out there, intelligence or conscientiousness or whatever it is, that construct. And we design measures then that we hope captures as much of that construct as is possible. And so validity is really looking at how well it actually captures that construct. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can assess the validity of something, and we'll talk about the different ways we can do that. Validity tells you what you can conclude about the score. So if we know that we have a valid measure, it's been validated, that it represents the construct, we can then know how valid that measure is and whether or not it's useful to us. Validity also will tell you how useful a measure is in a particular situation. Reliability is consistency over time, and validity then gives us a sense of whether or not it actually does what it says it does, and it measures what it says it does, and it enables us then to predict performance, which is our goal. Your measure absolutely has to be reliable to start with. You can't have a valid measure if it's not first reliable. So in order for you to use a measure, at a minimum, it has to be reliable, but then it also has to be valid. So reliability is necessary, but not sufficient to use for predicting the outcome that we want. So you have to make sure, first of all, that your measure is reliable. Then it needs to be accurate in its assessment of a construct and its ability to predict as you want it to predict. So just because, and again, I like sort of that last bullet point there, you might be able to measure a person's shoe size reliably, but does that mean it has anything to do with job performance? Well, of course, we know that, right? Or as we talked about before, a contaminated measure might be measuring, someone's attractiveness as a waiter or a waitress, but that doesn't mean that it has anything to do with their ability to be a good waiter or waitress on the job. So as it says in the bottom, any measure that we use in staffing not only has to be reliable, but it also has to have validity. It has to measure what we want it to measure reliably and correctly. It has to measure the construct that we want to measure, and it has to be able to be useful in predicting the outcome that's important to us, which is job performance. So the second slide shows the relationship between reliability and validity. And if you remember, as I said, that a measure has to be reliable, but that's not sufficient. It not only has to be reliable, but it also has to be valid in order for it to work. So the first graphic on the left-hand side, where it says reliable but not valid, what you're seeing is an example of systematic error, right? You want to hit the bullseye right there in the middle. However, all of your bullets or arrows or whatever it is are off to the upper left-hand side. They're all clustered in an area. Now, they're very reliable. When you shot every single time, you were really close and within a similar area, but you weren't accurate, right? So you were consistent to start with, but it wasn't accurate. And so in this situation, again, the difference between where the bullseye is and where you actually hit is an example of error or bias. Now, this could be random error, or it could be a systematic error or a systematic bias that was embedded in the measure, whatever it is. The middle category shows that something is neither reliable nor valid. And so what that means is that it was scattered all over the place. So there was no consistency in the way the instrument measured something. And in this case, no consistency in the way the bullets or the arrows hit the bullseye. And so they're scattered all over the place. So not only are they not reliable, but so there's no way they could be valid. So we don't know. On the far right-hand side, you see all the bullet holes or the arrows have hit in the middle, which is where you want it to be, on the bullseye. And so what that shows is not only is it reliable because it's consistent within a small area that you hit it, but it's also exactly what you want to be measuring, which is the bullseye. Or whatever the outcome is that you want. So On the far left, it's reliable but not valid, but on the far right, it's reliable and valid. And that's what we need with respect to measurement. So the next slide asks the question, what is validation? And validation is really how we establish that a measure is job related. So that it measures a construct that matters to us, and that measure predicts the outcome that we're looking for in the workplace, which is job performance or job success, or however we want to define that, whatever the job-related behavior is that we're looking for. So there's 3 different types of validation process, and you should all be familiar with this from your Management 430, but as a refresher, content-related validity, construct-related validity, and criterion-related validity. Largely, we don't do construct validation. It's much more challenging to do. Typically, as HR professionals, we get vendors that already give us construct-related validated tools. But on the off chance that they don't, we have a brief discussion about how to manage that. Most of the time, we'll be using things that are content or criterion related have criterion related validity, with content, basically the content of the measure matches the content of the job related behaviors that are important to us. So if the job requires us to hop on one foot and pat our head, then the measure that we're using could easily ask us to hop on one foot and pat our head. And if we can do that, then the content of the measure is matching the content of the job-related behavior we care about. Criterion-related validity is looking at the relationship, and it's usually based on a statistical relationship, correlation, etc., between the measure and the thing we're trying to predict. And we can do it based on concurrent validity, or we can base it on predictive validity. Concurrent, as you remember, may be at the same time. So my current performance and how I perform on a particular performance measure. And what my on-the-job performance is currently. Or we can predict it. So I measure it now and then I use it 2 or 3 years later into the future to see whether or not it had its predictive validity. Construct validity is basically where we are trying to make sure that the items that are in our measure match the domain or the construct, the domain of the construct or the concept that we're trying to measure. So for example, if you go back to your ACT or your SAT, the ACT test, where it had a series of questions that were all related to vocabulary or a verbal command of the language. And so the questions are all related to antonyms and synonyms and reading comprehension. And these are all part of having command of the language. And so construct validation says, are all those things directly related to the construct of verbal skills, right? And so we want to make sure that the content of the test matches what the general construct is or the concept is that we're trying to measure. Another aspect of validity that we don't spend a lot of time talking about in the intro class, but is something for us to consider as we get into these more advanced concepts on staffing, is face validity. And face validity is sort of the subjective way of making sure that items seem to be at their face value related to each other. And face validity is not something that we can go back to the courts and say, well, this had face validity. I mean, we can use content, construct, or criterion-related validity for the courts, but face validity is really important to our applicants. For example, if we are saying that how well they performed on a particular instrument predicts their job performance, we've got to be able to let them know how those things are related. We might understand it as researchers or as psychologists or as HR professionals. We know A predicts B, but our applicants may not be as informed about that. And so it really is important for us to have tools that we're using that have some degree of face validity, that they seem to make sense why performance on A predicts how well they would perform on the job. So we want to be careful, though, it has to have the content, criterion, or construct validity first. Then we want to try to use those tools that have face validity second, the ones where our applicants will look at it and go, well, that makes sense. If I do this, then I should be able to do well on the job. If you are only using face validity and you're not making sure that it has the content, criterion, or construct validity, then you're going to run into problems in the courts. So be aware of that. So in this next slide, we're trying to get at what is a validity coefficient and what does that look like for us? In essence, a validity coefficient is the same sort of criteria that we use like a correlation. In essence, it's the absolute value of the correlation between two instruments. So even if there has a negative correlation, as long as the magnitude of the correlation is high enough, then it's relevant and then we would use it. So as we said, it's the absolute value of the correlation between the predictor and the criterion. So our validity coefficients then only go from 0 to +1. So it can go 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, anywhere in between that. And so we're looking at how strong that correlation is between the predictor, the test that people take, and the outcome or the criterion. So it's in essence the relationship between the independent variable, which is the test that they take, and the dependent variable, which is performance on the job or job success, whatever that is. It's important to note that even though when we were talking about correlations and even reliability coefficients, we were saying that having really high numbers was really important. It's certainly in terms of magnitude of things and particularly in relationship with statistical significance, right? We said the higher the value, the more practical significance something has for us. Validity coefficients don't typically work that way. And why is that? Well, because if we're trying to predict an outcome, job success or job performance, there are many factors that contribute and go into someone's job success. Some of it is controllable and some of it is not controllable. Some things that we can manage by making sure people have resources and training, but we can't predict whether or not someone will engage in the training or someone will perform at the level that they can perform at or they should perform at. So there's also, we can only measure so many things that predict job performance. There are plenty of things that we can't measure that go into predicting job performance. And so when we're looking at the relationship between a predictor, such as an assessment test that we would give in selection, and its relationship with the criterion or the outcome that we want, which is performance, we can't really expect a validity coefficient to extend much beyond 0.4. I know that sounds scary, but think of it this way. If we are using 3 separate selection tools, each of which has a pretty good level of validity, and there it may be some overlap, but they have unique contributions towards understanding somebody's performance, then we're in a pretty good place if we're using a lot of really highly valid selection tools. Because if we have a 0.4 and a 0.3 and a 0.3, doesn't get much better than that, because in essence we are predicting almost as much of the outcome that we can in terms of success on the job. Remember, when we were talking about multiple regression, there is some overlap between measures. Like measures might both be getting at something in common. And so that's why you will find that if you use a lot of highly valid tools, you probably don't need to use too many of them, maybe 2 or 3 that get to the outcome that you're looking for. Because again, there's going to be some overlap between what the predictors can predict in terms of job success. So your goal, of course, is not to expect your validity coefficients to exceed 0.4. Maybe you'll approach 0.5, but rare to find that. Most of the time it's in the 0.3 to 0.4 range. Use the tools that you have that are as highly valid as is possible. Things that can approach 0.4 or just exceed 0.4 as much as you can. If you use multiple tools like that, then you are using as best of the methods, the best measures that we can use, and that would be supported in the courts under EEO law and the uniform guidelines of selection practices. just as we had guidelines for how to interpret reliability coefficients. And remember, the reliability coefficients, many of them do approach 1. 1.0. And we want our reliability coefficient to be as high as possible. We want it actually to be anywhere from 0.7 or above for us to be usable and reasonable to use. Validity coefficients are on a different scale, and so you are unlikely to see something that exceeds 0.4. So according to the guidelines here, anything that's above a 0.35 is incredibly beneficial. And so anything from 0.35 to 0.45-ish is what we would usually see, and those are the ones we would ideally like to use. Anything from 0.21 to 0.35 can be useful, but they may have some flaws. They may not be a perfect predictor. Anything really below 0.20 is really not that useful. Something in the 0.1 to 0.2 range might have some usefulness to us. For example, integrity tests might be useful to us, or a certain type of personality attribute that we're looking to measure. But by and large, what we're really looking for with our validity coefficients is an absolute value of the correlation between the predictor and the outcome, or the criterion, of about 0.2 or higher. And that's going to get us tools that we know are sound, that are pretty valid, and they are reliable. So when we're trying to figure out whether or not a validity coefficient is useful to us, we have to consider a whole host of factors, whether that assessment tool and its requisite validity are meaningful to us. And there's a lot of criteria that we need to consider, and we have to balance these criteria, and there's like 6 major issues that we need to consider. Number 1 is the level of adverse impact that's associated with the tool. Now, we know that there are some tools that have an adverse impact, that males will perform better than women and minorities on certain tests. Cognitive ability tests tend to be them, mostly because the cognitive ability test tends to have a bias towards a white male perspective. No matter what we try to do in terms of making it more inclusive, it still tends to take a white male bias to things. So, and this is, again, courts and researchers and analysts all have looked at this. And that doesn't necessarily mean that women and minorities don't have the same cognitive abilities. They do. It's just that it measures what parts of the brains people use is very different. So our goal is to minimize that adverse impact. So if we're using selection tools that we know are known to have an adverse impact against groups, we need to be mindful of that, so that we are balancing the use of those tools with an adverse impact with a tool that doesn't have an adverse impact. And so we want to make sure that they're in alignment and that we're using this information, and we're also being careful not to not to have an adverse impact against some groups. Now remember, there are times when even if we have an adverse impact, it is appropriate to not hire somebody if they don't have the baseline skills for the job. And typically that comes around like physical ability tests and things like that. If you can't hit that measure, and that's an important thing to do, if you can't lift a certain amount of weight, or if you can't run a certain distance, or whatever it is the criterion for the job, it doesn't matter if it has an adverse impact. If that's the minimum criteria needed to do a job, you've got to be able to do it. When it comes to cognitive abilities and personality tests and things like that, that's a little bit more difficult to prove, that the adverse impact on that is meaningful for the job. So we have to be very careful about the tools that we're using and which ones will have that adverse impact. Moving on, other things to consider is the number of applicants compared to the number of openings. And so again, when we're in a situation where we have a few applicants and a few openings, that validity coefficient may or may not be relevant to us. But when we have a lot of applicants for a certain number of openings, then we want to be clear about where, using validity tools that get us a good candidates for the job. So we want highly valid tools. Other things to consider when we're evaluating this is the number of currently successful employees. So if we have assessment tools that have a 0.25 or a 0.3 validity, say, and they're incredibly successful, then we don't need to have validity coefficients that are above that, right? So we don't need to worry about having something that's 0.35 or zero point 0.4 because we know that 0.3 seems to be enough to assess the success on the job. And it's not having, hopefully not having an adverse impact. If we are finding that it's not enough, then we do need to raise the validity of the tools that we use to something that's higher so that we absolutely can be sure that we are hiring the right people. If we're not having good, solid selection tools and we have unsuccessful candidates, we need to up the ante and we need to make the requirements more stringent and make sure that we're using more valid, highly valid selection tools. The next thing we have to consider is the cost of a hiring error. If there's a high cost of a hiring error, we want to err on the side of rejecting somebody over hiring somebody that we think would be underqualified to do a position. If the cost of the hiring error is low, like the fry cook at McDonald's, then it doesn't matter that much for us. And so we don't need to use highly valid tools to place the fry cook at McDonald's into a position, in the restaurant. And so we have to think about the cost of that hiring error to the organization. Then there's the cost of the selection tool. A tool could cost an enormous amount of money, but it may not get you anything more meaningful. The utility of this is actually what we're getting at. The utility of that selection tool may not be any more meaningful than the cost for a tool that is half the price. If it's not giving you twice as much validity and twice as much accuracy in your hiring process, why spend the money on it? So it's always this cost-benefit analysis that you're trying to do. And you're going to see this when you get into the simulation, that the goal is finding the right mix of tools that doesn't cost you a lot of money, but at the same time, it gives you the most bang for the buck in terms of its ability to have a good predictor of outcomes that you're looking for. Lastly is that in order to consider, another thing to consider for validity coefficients is the probability of hiring a qualified applicant without using that assessment tool at all. If your probability of getting a good candidate is high, if you don't use that tool, then why would you use it? It costs you money. So find something else to use that's lower cost and is, would meaningfully contribute to the outcome that you're looking for. So if you don't need that applicant tool, don't give it to people. It makes no sense to do that. It costs you money and time and effort that is not necessarily relevant. So getting back to this discussion on, what should we consider when we're thinking about designing our selection package or our selection system, we have to consider and recognize that reliability isn't enough. It needs to be valid. But even validity is not enough when we're considering which tools to use. We need to think about the applicants, and we want to make sure that we have a system in place that is not creating an adverse impact. It's one thing to have a tool that may have an adverse impact as long as it's balanced against tools that don't have adverse impacts. If we have tools that are only creating an adverse impact, we're going to get into a lot of trouble with that. But we do want to make sure we're creating a system and a bunch of tools that are in place are going to have high face validity, are less likely to result in lawsuits, and are less likely to have an adverse impact against protected groups. The next thing we want to consider is the time and the cost. Again, it's great to have a wonderful, highly valid selection tool, but if it takes forever to go through the process, if it costs a lot of money and it costs a lot of time, it may not give us the results that we want. Is there something that costs less or takes less time that will have a relatively similar impact? And so again, what we're looking for is that cost-benefit analysis, that balance between spending a ton of money and getting an outcome and spending slightly less money and getting a relatively similar outcome. You would always want to try to spend slightly less money. So you have to consider all those factors. And just as it says here, a valid assessment system can have an unacceptably long time to fill or an unacceptable cost to hire. So you might lose high-quality candidates, or you might be only identifying candidates who want really high salaries that you can't afford to pay. So you have to really consider balancing all the costs, what you can and can't pay, and what is the potential outcome that you'll get from spending a ton of money on a high quality candidate. Well, that's great. Well, then you're going to have to pay them for that too. You can't just say, well, I know that you're high quality, but I'm going to pay you $10,000 less than you would make elsewhere. People aren't going to want to take those jobs. Along with the cost and the adverse impact, we have to think about future recruits. A system isn't good if it takes a really long time to move people through the system. We're more likely to lose the high quality candidates. They're going to be gobbled up by other companies who have a quicker system in place. And we may end up with lower quality candidates because our process just takes too long, and the only ones that are going to stick with the process are those who are desperate and need a job. So of course they're not going to be putting pressure on you to move quicker because they don't have any other options. So you want to make sure you don't have any adverse hiring issues, which means that you take so long or the process is so complicated that you can't move the system fast enough. And so our goal, of course, also is to make sure that we're treating people fairly so that future recruits would also look at our company and say, this company is nice, they're fair, they treat us well. So we want to keep that in mind. Word of mouth can hurt you. Right? If you really don't treat people well, or if you take too much time to do stuff, that gets back to potential job seekers, and the good people may not want to come and apply for your company. And so remember when we were talking about the talent curve, right? And your talent curve may end up being all those people on the left-hand side of that graphic where the active job seekers are only the ones that are the lower quality people who are actively looking to recruit with you because you haven't done a good job of managing the time or the costs, or you're not treating people fairly. So you're never going to attract the high quality people. You're only going to attract the lower quality people. Current employees are another factor to consider. You want to make sure that you don't have a system that only favors external candidates and doesn't favor your internal candidates. We want to have something that is fair to everybody. So we can have internal criteria that we use to assess whether or not someone is ready for a promotion. So we might look at some criteria to see if they're ready for the promotion. And then we would then go to a system that we treat everybody well in terms of the external factors. The last thing you need to consider when we're talking about validity generalization and validation is whether or not the results from a validation test done in one context are generalizable to a different context or to a different group of employees. For example, a selection tool that's validated with a certain set of employees may not work with a different set of employees in your company. Further, stuff that's done in one company may not be valid for another. So part of the challenge that we need if we're using an external vendor and we are gathering validity information, we need to know the context within which the validation was done across a whole bunch of different companies. Now, there are statistical ways to prove this, right? You use a meta-analysis, and I won't even get into the nuances of what a meta-analysis is, but generally speaking, you're trying to analyze at a larger meta level all the different tests to see whether or not there is some validity in the way that those were measured. But there is never any guarantee that a test that was validated in one company will also work in another. And so the more evidence you have across a whole bunch of different companies that the test is valid for certain categories of employees, the more confidence you have that it probably will work well for you. Validity generalization is not something that is that is understood with respect to the law and used necessarily with respect to its legal acceptability, but we can have more confidence when we know that tools that are used in certain contexts, if they're used in a wide variety of contexts, it will lend credence to the fact that it would probably work in our company. So how does this apply to you if you're the HR professional? Well, a vendor comes in, they offer you a selection tool, and they say it's highly valid. And then the questions that you have to ask is, how many organizations did you measure it in? How good was the validity, the average validity across those companies? where did you see problems? Where weren't there problems? Did it work with some groups of employees but not others? Did it work with higher level employees versus lower level employees? Did it work with this kind of employee versus that kind of employee? So we need to understand where it works and where it doesn't work. And the more diverse information we have that supports that it is a good tool, the more confidence we can have that using it in our company makes sense.